Welcome, welcome everyone. So good to see all your smiling faces and so many familiar names. Hi, Carla. So it is my honor to get to introduce Maywa Montenegro today, a scholar activist who I know myself and many of my colleagues at the Institute sincerely admire for her transdisciplinary, astute, and often deeply poetic commitment and contribution to the development of political agroecology and justice in our food system. Today, we look forward to hearing from Maywa about her family history and personal identity, inform her work and pursuit of synergies between Western science and indigenous and traditional knowledge systems and abolitionist agroecology. From her background in molecular biology at Williams College to science writing at MIT and working as a journalist at NYC, to her PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California, Berkeley, Maywa makes thoughtful connections across fields and writes about them in compelling ways, making her a grounding and radical presence in the agroecology movement. And today she is an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz, where she focuses on the implications of new biotechnologies and politics of knowledge in and around the advancement of agroecology, food and seed sovereignty, and commons for seeds and intellectual property alike. We are thrilled to be with you today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Maywa.
Am I able to share my screen? And thank you, Ayana, for the intro.
Yes,
Okay.
you should be able to.
Okay, let me see. I'm gonna try the split screen so that I can still see your faces while I deliver. Are you able to now see? Let me see.
It looks great.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ayana, and thanks everyone for coming out. I appreciate the series on the whole and what it's doing and how it is bringing together folks from both UVM and the wider world. So I appreciate that a lot. As I understand, one of the goals, we're kind of trying to talk about agroecology, but also think about this project, this world making of agroecology as a transdiscipline. And so one of the things that I'm interested in kind of doing today is invite you into my world as a scholar
como una activista
agroecology, scholar activism, food sovereignty, and also kind of struggles for indigenous life and land, Black and Brown experiences with food justice and food sovereignty. And to begin, I'd like to talk a little bit then about my family heritage, intentionally entangling the personal with the scholarly for a simple reason. So some of you may be familiar with the work of Anna Singh. Anna is a professor here at UC Santa Cruz, whose explorations of mushrooms and foraging cultures encourages us to think about the rhizomatic encounters amongst human and non-human agents in the natural world, where we cannot help but be what she calls contaminated and fundamentally changed through these interactions, because we are never in fact separate from capitalism's world ecology. And yet denying the interconnectedness is precisely what I would argue the modern colonial food system does. So separations and kind of this logic of separation were and remain at the heart of indigenous land dispossession, right? Separating natives from their means of subsistence and their livelihoods. Separations historically threw peasants off of their common field agriculture and into low-paid wage work at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. They continue to cleave communities from their inherited and intergenerational knowledge, now justifying property rights in everything from seeds to art to music to scholarly publishing, whereas all of that could be common or held in common. And this happens at many levels, from globally spanning economic structures to the personal and interpersonal levels, where, for example, we are trained to be good scientists, by supposedly seeming biased or impartial, and compartmentalizing our research lives away from the rest of our lives as workers, as community members, as political subjects. And that rhizomatic complexity is what I believe Anna's work and that of others encourages us to embrace. So today I'd like to share with you a bit of my mushroom self, or at least as much as we can pack into 45 minutes or so. I'll share with you a little bit of my background and origin story, connecting scholarship in seeds and agrobiodiversity, then on to agroecology. I'll give a nutshell summary of my research interests presently, and then focus in a little bit on what I'm thinking with this concept of abolitionist agroecology. So first, I grew up in Northeast Tennessee in a farming community tucked into the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. So Tennessee is a nice parallelogram, and I grew up on the right-hand corner tip in Washington County. One of my favorite memories is my mom coming home from work carrying bags of farm fresh red tomatoes, like the one you see here on the left. Now, my mom worked as a rheumatologist, treating patients with arthritis, bone disease, lupus. As you might imagine, that affects not just, but principally older patients. And one of them was Mr. Phillips. Now, Mr. Phillips was both our car mechanic and a farmer. And oftentimes in lieu of payment, because he was uninsured, Mr. Phillips would effectively barter. He brought bags of green beans and pickles and these delicious tomatoes. Now, I did not understand at that time that what I was indirectly experiences was the edge of rural crisis, where farmers across the US, including in this region of Tennessee, were being thrown off the land for development, which were deeply in debt, uninsured, and cash poor, and only staying afloat because of these off-farm jobs like being a mechanic, and the disability insurance that people like my mother could provide. All I knew is that I did love those tomatoes. I also ate a lot of potatoes growing up, which is where my family story breaks wide open from Tennessee to the global scale. Now, both of my parents are immigrants to the US. My mother is from the Netherlands and my father is from Peru. Now, as many of you know, the Bolivian and Peruvian Andes are the center and origin of crop biodiversity for potatoes. My father's people, the indigenous Caxamarcan people, long predated the Incas. The Incas were a relatively brief existence. They brought the Caxamarcans into the empire for a period of roughly 70 years prior to Spanish invasion in the 16th century. Now, European colonizers sought gold and silver famously in the Andes. Another treasure Europeans found in Peru was agrobiodiversity. Tomatoes, strawberries, papayas, amaranth, quinoa, all come from this part of the world, and particularly diverse in number and variety are potatoes and potato relatives like tarwi that exist in the highlands. Estimates vary because you can count diversity in many ways, which is one interest of mine, but between 1,400 and 4,000 different types of cultivars and varieties have been identified in this region. So unsurprisingly, it's very much a part not only of the culinary heritage, but also central to territory, to our knowledge, to customary law, even spirituality, with what indigenous communities sometimes refer to as the Ayu. Just cutting in here briefly, what you're seeing here on the slide, obviously on the right hand upper panel is some of that rich crop agrobiodiversity. The lower right hand is southern Peru. This is in near the Valle Sagrado or Sacred Valley near Cusco. On the left hand panel is actually different region. It's northern Cajamarca. That's where my family is from. That's my grandma, Mami Sarita, me on my first trip, and my awesome orange socks, which I still have. So going back to the Ayu, the main concept, the main objective of IU is the attainment of good living, or sumak kalse. Now, IU is sometimes translated as community because it emphasizes these communal rights and responsibilities over um, uh, we don't, when I realized the language on the slide, it may be a little bit confusing. It's not responsibilities over property, it's instead of property rights. We emphasize communal rights and responsibilities. We emphasize equilibrium between one's natural and social surroundings and maintaining reciprocity between all beings, including the earth. So kind of letting that sink in a little bit. These things are easy to kind of rattle off and not really absorb, but the fundamental rejection or non-recognition of private property rights has so many implications for the way that we treat land, the relationships in and with land. I heard a brilliant scholar earlier this week reflect on the way, the difference between a settler colonial relation to land and an indigenous relation to land. And she says, and I believe others have said it too, with indigenous peoples, we belong to the land. With settler colonial relations to land, it says the land belongs to us. And so the IU is very much in the former category of the people belonging to the land. And in fact, for the entirety of my research career, every time I talk to my father about how my department is named, like society and environment or people and nature, he continually finds this and baffling, right? Because people are nature, people are part of nature in the indigenous cosmovision. So there's no need for the and or the ampersand. Now, during the Columbian exchange in 1492, those potatoes and a good many other crops were taken over to Europe. Now, less typically emphasized about the Columbian exchange is that while seeds and tubers were flowing across the Atlantic, the practices, cultures, and underlying cosmovisions were not typically a part of that exchange. As a result, Europeans struggled to successfully cultivate these potatoes that they stole, not understanding agrobiodiversity in a relational sense. They failed to think about the plants, the other organisms in this broader ecosystem. They took only a few types of tubers or potatoes and planted even fewer. So this relative monoculture potato system that they established, including in places like Ireland, turned out to have devastating consequences. Many of you have probably heard of the Great Irish Potato Famine in the late 19th century that occurred when a bacterial blight infected potato crops across the country. It killed roughly 1 million people due to famine. Now, those people, at least a million, perished from hunger. Another million had to emigrate because those potatoes were just not thriving. People often blame the microbe for this famine, right? But the deeper and underlying cause was monoculture and that colonial habit of extraction, separation, again, this concept, separation of organisms from their interdependent environments in which they had evolved. Potatoes nonetheless continued to be cultivated across Europe and especially in Germanic and Nordic countries. Vincent van Gogh's early painting, The Potato Eaters, epitomizes the hardscrabble life often associated with this era's peasantry and working poor. So if my father's ancestors were colonized by the Spaniards, my mother's ancestors here, Vincent van Gogh is Dutch, not only benefited from these potatoes, but also built up this huge empire of tea, coffee, and nutmeg, especially in Southeast Asia, or what they called the East Indies. My grandparents on my mother's side were in fact born and raised on the Indonesian island of Java, in what was called then Batavia, the Dutch occupied East Indies. Colonized by the Netherlands in 1600, Indonesia was mined for its soil fertility, specifically through the plantation agricultural system called Tanam Paksa. You can see here where Dutch colonists were overseeing women who are doing the work of planting some of the seedlings. Farmers were required to pay taxes in the form of specified amounts of crops, sugar, coffee, and very famously tea. Now, World War II and national resistance brought an end to Dutch rule in 1949, but not before the profits from the Dutch East Indies made the Netherlands one of the most significant colonial powers. At the height of its trade, it was worth about $7.9 trillion, which in adjusted monetary terms is roughly equivalent to the wealth of these 20 companies today. So just a massive monopoly. Like, it's very hard to conceive the wealth and power of this single company at that time. By the 1970s, my parents made their way to the United States and ultimately to Tennessee, which is what I mentioned a moment ago, where I grew up, and slowly began to appreciate more and more how histories of racism, colonialism, oppression, and resistance to all of those forces aren't just asides when it comes to agriculture and food systems. They help create the ideological and structural foundation for the food system as we know it. Now, seeds and agrobiodiversity are where I see some of those ties most intimately, and it's where I initially focused a significant amount of my research, including in my PhD. These are some images from my dissertation in which I looked at historical trends in agrobiodiversity globally. So what is sometimes called loss. I was a little curious about that, the passivity of that term loss. I was like, there's probably forces driving this loss. This doesn't just happen. What is causing this via dispossession or enclosures of seeds and knowledge and intellectual property? I looked at resistance to those forces, such as the seed sovereignty movement, famously associated with large international movements like La Via Campesina, but also rooted locally in small communities who are deriving alternatives, whether it be through seed saving networks or through more legal frameworks like alternatives to intellectual property. So, for example, the Open Source Seed Initiative was the group that I found very fascinating, and I studied for one chapter. They are a group of university public plant breeders, social scientists, and independent, self-trained, autonomous farmer breeders who are trying to develop non-proprietary commons for sharing, breeding, and doing research on seeds for diversified farming systems. And they gave me an excellent window onto the challenges that it takes to do this within the land-grant university system, for the innovativeness of these independent farmer breeders, and also to some of the critiques from Indigenous communities of open source approaches, and how they were kind of struggling through this negotiation of what we call a commons for seeds. Now at Berkeley, I also became quite active in something that initially seemed lateral to my research, just something to go to an interesting talk to, a brown bag lunch, a round table, but over time became to ground and center much of my work. And I'm referring to agroecology, typically described as a science, practice, and social movement for the ecological design and management of sustainable food systems. What I see in agroecology today is much more than that. It is a transformative paradigm, not just for growing food, but for remaking the world based on the coevolution of Western science, Indigenous ecological knowledge, and legitimizing the ways that working people experience and therefore know about food systems. It extends as well to the agency of non-human organisms and to knowledge in the living world around us. Now, STS researcher Sheila Jasanoff sometimes speaks about this wider legitimation of diverse knowledges in terms of epistemic justice. Epistemic justice, of course, doesn't just exist once you name it. That would be nice in some ways if all it took to say epistemically just research must exist. We just have to put a name on it, write a paper. It's something that must be learned about, struggled over, worked through. An example of one of the ways I think that we hear this a lot in communities of science is when we hear experts in the media say that we should just listen to the scientists when it comes to things like climate change, as if that kind of is the way forward, is the public, policymakers, and so forth need to listen to the science as a neutralizing force to help us through contentious issues. But that perspective, in fact, that science is value neutral, that it is universal, that it is apolitical, is itself a kind of politics. And it's one that is particularly powerful, I would say, in Western liberal traditions, including the science which stems from the Enlightenment, from colonial modern origins, and has now evolved alongside the march of globalization and these drivers of colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism. I like this artistic rendering of some of these from artist Julia Forsyth that shows that science is really hardly separated from colonial habits of thought. It's not apart from these economic drivers. And so, as I believe many folks in this room kind of know and probably resonate with, to not be ashamed of or try to cloak the non-subjectivity of science. Our goal is then to kind of I would say, express that science can be interpreted, is interpreted in many ways, and a goal of ours is to create more of a kaleidoscope of these multiple partial knowledges as a way of generating a more robust objectivity around the world. It's not to hide that we approach science from particular partial perspectives. So kind of questioning and reflexively recalibrating my role as a scientist is a journey that I have been on, am on, as a woman, as an Indigenous person, beginning with my career in molecular biology. I actually studied microbes as an undergrad. Then I continued through working in a magazine for a while. I got a master's degree in journalism and spent several years in Manhattan working as a science writer, editor, journalist, and then in my current life, I am a social scientist who mostly identifies with the field of political ecology and science and technology studies. I won't go through the arc of how all of those different fields evolve into one another, but I will say that an engagement with food systems was really at the heart of the last kind of transition from journalism into social science. And part of that was because as I was working at Seed Magazine, I was there in 2008, 2009. There was a global food crisis. Many of you will remember this. And me being a reporter, pick up the phone, call people, email people, ask them what is going on, what is driving this food crisis. The UN General Assembly had met, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food was talking about the need to kind of sound the alarm bells, right? I spoke with the scientific advisor for Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, and she told me that one of the goals we must have for the future is to genetically engineer a wider variety of crops that could be local, that could be more diverse, that we need a next generation of biotechnology for small farmers. So I thought, that's brilliant. I know how to do that. This was my undergrad work. We can genetically engineer for the future of sustainable food systems. I also talked to people like Jahi Chappell at the University of Michigan. I talked to people like Raj Patel, and Raj was saying, we actually produce too much food. This is part of the problem. We don't have a production problem. So here I'm typing my manuscript, trying to like make sense of this all. And I recognized that I was kind of at an impasse of my own understanding. There were tensions and contradictions in these storylines, and they were much bigger than narratives. They were historical. And I realized I got to go back to school. So that's what I did. I made my way back to Berkeley, did my PhD, did a postdoc, got very interested in the next generation of biotechnology, which is CRISPR, And these today kind of form the two main spheres of my research. So one on agroecology and food sovereignty, science, knowledge systems, social movements. I'm very interested in epistemological friction, the tensions and challenges between ways of knowing and ways of being, and then technology politics. So not just GMOs now, but also CRISPR, the next generation of what we call gene editing. Most of you, if you have been walking on the earth for the last 5 years, have just seen an explosion, data, digital agriculture, and increasingly how AI is articulating with those systems. Now, what I want to kind of shift to now is thinking about how I've been trying to connect agroecology and abolition. So brief pause. I know we're in 2024. We're still in the long COVID crisis, but try to remember back to early January 2020. First few months of COVID, early days, lots of fear in my recollection, bewilderment, kind of panic about how to keep my loved ones safe, how to keep myself safe, what to touch, what to wash, what to mask, whether I should go out of the house at all. In and amongst that anxiety about how not to die, I was also really interested in how the media, as a journalist, remember, I was interested in how the media was portraying food system disruption. Stories about farmers who were smashing eggs, plowing their vegetables under, those were showing up on the headlines. We were seeing many stories of raided supermarket shelves, of people trying to or hoarding food. The headline says as they stocked up on basic needs. Restaurants were closing up or going online. And some media noted how these different chokeholds in the supply chain had disproportionate effects that were borne by communities of color and the poor. However, what was largely missing from these media headlines, I noted, was threefold. I didn't see any curiosity about the ecological origins of the pandemic, which continue to be debated, I will say, but specifically ones that were interested in the role of agriculture, what might be the connections. Didn't see much discussion there. I didn't see much recognition either that Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities and the poor were often at risk, not just by some random chance, but because of their proximity to the food system via labor. And I didn't see any direct engagement with the question that these features were not merely outcomes, but rather that racism is what enables these exploitations to occur. It's what drives the ecological degradation and therefore pandemics to emerge in the first place. And this is where I started making these connections. So to give us some common language here, racial capitalism is associated typically with the scholar Cedric Robinson, author of Black Marxism, who, alongside others developing this concept, argued that capitalism is never not racial. So we don't necessarily have to say racial capitalism to know that capitalism is always racist. But this helps us kind of pin that idea in our brains. By tracing forms of racism that pre-existed capitalism, Robinson showed how racialization, which we can understand as a process of differentiation, enabled things like land enclosures, peasant dispossession, and thus the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe in the 16th century. So the idea here is that racism is what drives land enclosures, primitive accumulation, the dispossession of the peasantry. And this starting point helped him and others subsequently see that capitalism did not somehow break free from racism that was embedded in medieval society to produce, it instead survived the transition from feudalism to capitalism to produce a modern world food system of racial capitalism dependent on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. Now, racial capitalism, I want to suggest, gives us a window then onto the pervasive race-class inequalities in the food system that COVID-19 hardly began. This did not start in 2020, but it exposed brutally, and it did so in a couple of ways that I traced. So one is in the pandemic origin. As industrial agriculture continues to encroach onto some of the last forested places on Earth, dangerous pathogens are being released in its path. Research by Rob Wallace and colleagues has shown that primary natural habitats are contracting at record rates, and the interfaces of human-wild interactions is therefore expanding, and with it, the rate and likelihood of pathogen spillover from wildlife to people. And the deeper the agribusiness growth, including also mining and forestry, and those are all related kind of extractive industries, the deeper that growth cuts into the forest, then the more likely, probabilistically speaking, that zoonotic diseases can therefore spread. And that spillover rate from wildlife to human populations is matched only in terms of what we have constructed, not just on the frontiers of agribusiness cutting into the forest, but what we've constructed in these nice self-contained contraptions called the modern TAFO, or concentrated animal feed operation. These things that are deemed the paragon of efficiency in the modern industrial food system for poultry production, for animal production, but what actually create the ideal conditions for pathogens to emerge and spread. So anytime these animals are tightly packed together, beak to snout, and forced to live in relatively unsanitary conditions, tremendous stress is put on these animals' immune systems. Moreover, the fact that these fowl have been bred to be genetically uniform, that serves the virus very well. As long as a germ can successfully infect one animal, one bird or beast, it can kind of mow through the entire population without encountering any genetic variation, which would otherwise kind of put the brakes on its ability to continually being transmitted, and therefore kind of slowing it down, containing it. By contrast, if you had a diversified animal operation, the pathogen would be regularly encountering hosts that it was not viable in anymore. So kind of putting, again, that kind of natural containment system. As Rob Wallace explained to Vox News at the time, this again was early in the pandemic, if you get a barn with 15,000 turkeys or 250,000 layer chickens, you can just burn right through. There's no cap on your being a badass. To me, all of this said that the environmental injustices perpetrated from racial capitalism through the global slave trade, colonial conquest, and dispossession all set in motion and connect to the rise and inevitability of what are, in retrospect, not very surprising pandemics. Cut loose, pathogens spread on global circuits of commerce and trade, sweeping the planet at an astonishing rate. And people who were looking at transmission rates at the time were kind of showing these massive and very quick flows of the virus around the world from where it was anticipated to have emerged to sites of, especially places with big airports, which may not be surprising, but those map onto sites of industrial capitalism as well. So COVID-19 represents only one of several pathogens to have emerged in the 21st century. But what we saw, particularly at this time, was that the pandemic risk was unevenly borne because of racial injustices in food system labor, embedded in food system labor. Despite Twitter memes to the contrary, at the time, we were never, quote unquote, all in this together in the pandemic. We saw, for example, Latina and indigenous folks in the field in California and Florida who were told to keep 6 feet apart while being transported in overcrowded buses, who were living in massively overcrowded housing situations, not being given the break time to wash their hands, or told they could wash their hands, but that was time unpaid for work. We saw it in the meatpacking sector, powered principally by African American, Central American, and increasingly East African and Burmese workers. Their job was nearly impossible to do while wearing personal protective equipment. Folks described blood spattering on their face shields, forcing workers to wipe them off, while processing line speeds actually sped up during the pandemic because Tyson and JBS said that they must speed up in order to keep those grocery shelves stocked fully. We saw it among restaurant workers who were laid off by the millions when lockdowns went into effect. Workers of color, and especially women, were exposed to harm, not necessarily because they went to work, but because they had no work to turn to. Now, I was watching all of this go down, again, reading headlines. I realized what I'm sure many of you notice is that agroecology and food sovereignty could together provide an effective response to some of the core issues that the pandemic has crystallized. For example, agroecology could help contain the risks of zoonotic spillover by diversifying landscapes. Environmental stochasticity, or unpredictability, acts as an inherent brake on pathogen momentum at the population level. With practices like planting landrace varieties, polycropping, legume rotations, biological control with natural enemies, agroecology supports agrobiodiversity and thus can help restore that braking power, not only at the farm level, but at the wider landscape scale. Food sovereignty, meanwhile, supports agrarian reform and peasant-led agriculture that limits then the extent to which agribusiness can just push into the countryside. It shortens supply chains and it deepens democratic and localized control over systems of production and consumption that became so vulnerable in the pandemic, largely due to the concentration of corporate power. So I thought I was going to write about that. I'm going to take agroecology and food sovereignty and write a paper about that as a resistance to the pandemic. Not only did Miguel Altieri beat me to the punch, he wrote a nice essay at the time. Walden Bello also wrote a thing. I was just too slow for this. But also that spring, the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, in quick succession, struck a match with communities worldwide. The summer of 2020 may go down in history as Floyd's rebellion, but it was more fundamentally a mass rejection of routinized state violence, one that brought communities in the US and around the world out into the streets in protest of police brutality. Now, for many people, this was definitely not new. For me, what was new at the time was the introduction to organizing spaces in and around the University of California, where people were studying and collectively working towards police and prison abolition. I learned then how abolition has agrarian origins. For example, as the first police in the US South were slave patrols to catch runaway plantation workers. I learned how the UCs themselves have worked to institutionalize racism, not only through indigenous land theft, on which land grant universities are built through our endowments, but also through Reagan-era introduction of tuition at the universities, which were designed to make our education less accessible to Black and Brown communities. I learned how abolitionists, like agroecologists, have a powerful vision of social transformation at the center of their theory and practice. So I decided to take this agroecological response and turn it into one about abolitionist agroecology. This idea is very much a living project, but I'll start today with a few lessons that agroecologists can learn from abolition and maybe vice versa, and then open it up for some conversation. So again, to kind of give us some lingua franca, abolition might be described as a practical strategy and a political vision to eliminate slavery, imprisonment, policing, militarism, state surveillance, and ultimately racial capitalism itself. It is about dismantling all forms of oppression that racial capitalism creates and normalizes, and creating lasting alternatives to violence. And it's in that first part that I saw a first lesson for food movements. In the tradition of abolitionists like the great Angela Davis, Mariam Kaba, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, abolition is never simply about dismantling or getting rid of systems of violence. It is always also about reimagining and building the world anew. As Gilmore says, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. Now, grassroots organizations that she co-founded with Davis, like Critical Resistance, say abolition isn't only about throwing the prison doors wide open, that terrifies everyone, especially Republicans, and having no alternatives in place. Rather, it's about new models for living. For folks who work on the prison industrial complex, this means strategy like creating community support systems and mutual aid systems. It means calling neighbors, family, and friends instead of the police. It means providing access to trauma counselors, mental health workers, violence interrupters at the neighborhood level. It means building resources for people who are coming out of prisons and giving them on-ramps into jobs after coming out. It means fighting police control of the houseless population, which, as many of you know, in California is very large. And answering the question, who makes us safe? We do. You know, it's not necessarily the state or policing that makes us safe, but it is we. It also goes beyond merely coping with trauma and tragedy already in our midst, which you can see from these bullet points are all kind of in that coping mechanism process already, but also asking us to identify the root cause structural drivers of violence and tugging at those roots. So what is it that creates conditions of houselessness? What is it that creates those conditions of violence? So it asks us more about creating access to universally available high quality healthcare, affordable housing for everyone, nourishing and ecologically sustainable and culturally appropriate food. And, you know, anyone who works in food system knows, and land then is a precondition for all of that to occur. For folks who are educators, it very much demands access to an intellectual commons. And I love kind of thinking about educational spaces. How could they be common? Maybe they could have housing for community members as well, workers, students, community members, where academics are all equally valued and centered in visions of educational futures. So these are the kinds of elements abolitionists consider preconditions for a violence-free life. Similarly, agroecology is intrinsically not a negative strategy. This was kind of a no-brainer for me. Agroecology was very much about building life-affirming institutions, life-affirming systems of production. It is fundamentally about nourishing life, growing communities, literally of living organisms in relation to one another. It goes beyond techno fixes, pressing for root cause approaches to food insecurity, hunger, and environmental unsustainability. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a bit here, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I think we also often always confront this response. Isn't that just very romantic? Isn't it too utopian to achieve? And that is a connection to abolition, where we also always hear, you can't just get rid of police. Isn't that too utopian to achieve? Abolitionists respond to that by saying very simply, utopias are made by us. We bring these down to earth with practical strategies, specifically by reallocating resources that already exist. For example, money can be directly diverted from police budgets and reinvested in health, in housing, in the education our people deserve. According, for example, to the Center for Popular Democracy, the NYPD budget in 2020 came in at about $6 billion. LAPD budget had about $1.7 billion, accounting for roughly a quarter of the city's general fund. On a national scale, you can see some potential to divest from militarized spending, where data from the Office of Management and Budget shows that the US spent roughly $1.14 trillion, or 62% of the federal discretionary budget in 2023 on militarized programs, defined here as including weapons and war-related infrastructure, law enforcement and mass incarceration, and detention and deportation costs. Abolitionists ask, what if instead we redirect these substantial resources towards things that actually keep us alive and safe? Now, in food systems, we have plenty of sites where divest-invest strategies could take hold. Take the USDA, for example. Research by DeLong and colleagues showed that the total USDA budget in 2014 was roughly $157.5 billion. Of that, they found that a mere 12 million went to projects with transformative agroecological potential, meaning that they integrated social with ecological aspects in the project. It's also important for agroecologists to recognize that while more investment won't bring about agroecology tomorrow, it actually is a reversal of historical underinvestment in agroecology that has cut short the lifespan of alternatives to the industrial model that could have emerged had we funded them properly. We once, in fact, had a world-class apparatus of biological control research with faculty, staff, students, and facilities at UC Berkeley, UC Riverside, and UC Davis, alongside an experiment station in Albany, which is about 5 miles south of the Berkeley main campus. In the 1980s, this system started to be undercut by investments that favored molecular biology, genetics, engineering, and other sciences that were definitely interesting and exciting, but that also importantly were more amenable to creating intellectual property rights and commodity inputs for agro-industry. This world-class system was systematically dismantled, and there's many writings about this in papers like the one screenshot here by Bruce Jennings, The Killing Fields, that document this. Resources are not scarce, in other words. They're only, as Gilmore argues, sequestered within and by a prison industrial complex that functions to maintain an unjust social order by tying up resources. The prison industrial complex worked by securing and mobilizing surplus finance capital, land, labor, and state capacity into carceral functions. So utopia means kind of scrubbing that scarcity model from our mindsets and asking us to embrace strategies of abundance and that then redistribute that abundance. The third lesson is that reform is not enough. So following summer of 2020, reformist solutions to policing quickly surfaced. Universities across the US began assembling police task forces, populated frequently by faculty of color. Police departments pledged to revisit policies on things like chokeholds. This campaign, called 8 Can't Wait, garnered celebrity endorsements online for a platform that included things you can see here, like warning before shooting and other remedies billed as effective, no cost, and easy to implement. Abolitionists criticize such moves, not only because they assume someone is still going to get shot, but because they are also empirically shown to be ineffective in harm reduction, especially long-term. Reams of peer review research shows, in fact, that rates of police interactions with people tend to increase measures of physical and mental distress, that rates of sexual violence do not go down with increased policing, and that police officers themselves typically acknowledge not being well equipped to deal with mental health crises for which they are called. That's not what their training is for. Now, agroecologists, we have our own struggles with reformism. Within the past decade, agroecology has gained a huge amount of popularity with everyone from FAO to USDA to CropLife, this chemical industry trade group embracing agroecology. These developments certainly keep us on our toes. What is reform? What is transformation? It's not always easy to say. We might easily be able to pick out that someone who is literally representing Bayer may not have agroecology's best interest in mind. It's a little more difficult when it comes to movements and wins that have definitely resulted in improvements for fast food farm, for farm workers, for food workers, for more organic options at the supermarket. These struggles have resulted in paid sick leave and protective gear for meatpacking workers. They've resulted in agriculture's inclusion in policy frameworks like the Green New Deal. At the same time, it's worth pausing and reflecting that these wins themselves can typically turn into piecemeal reforms if we perceive them as endpoints rather than as paths towards structural transformation. Because, giving workers better pay at McDonald's still means that McDonald's is the one who is extracting surplus value from these workers, just keeping people a little bit more comfortable in the process. Without such an analysis, it becomes all too easy to mistake winning for just accepting a little less abuse. Finally, struggles always take us back to land. And this is the fourth and final lesson. Agroecology is deeply agrarian. Histories trace roots back to the plantation, a system which grew not only cotton, but also a hierarchical workplace management system that quickly gave rise to what scholars have called a uniquely severe and unbridled form of American capitalism. Long before meatpacking disassembly lines, the plantation enabled punishing data tracking systems to capitalize on economies of scale in cotton farming. After the Civil War, planters turned to convict leasing to help keep this system intact. Companies and plantation owners leased prisoners to build railroads and to perform agricultural labor. Though convict leasing was gradually phased out in the early 20th century in most states, slave labor and plantation land continued to serve as prison farms in the 21st century. Indeed, former plantations make up some of the 130,000 agricultural acres managed and operated in Texas, for example, and their Department of Criminal Justice. In Louisiana, the Angola State Penitentiary continues to function as a working plantation, with inmates growing food for all of Louisiana's prisons and cattle for the open market. Now, Gilmore describes the expansion of prisons in California as a geographical solution to socioeconomic problems. She shows how prisons like San Quentin are sited on devalued rural land with formerly irrigated acreage, and she situates this prison industrial complex within historical cycles of global capital accumulation that have continuously required and therefore reproduced a carceral system that is dependent on stolen landscapes, which are mutually constituted by indigenous dispossession, border imperialism, and racial capitalism. So I like to kind of think with this concept of stolen landscape as a starting point, a place from which abolitionist agroecology can begin. How do we steal those landscapes back? And the wonderful thing is, we don't have to start from scratch. It is happening already. So as many of you know, in the decades since World War I, a so-called white land grab nearly destroyed Black agriculture. From a peak in 1920, Black families have lost nearly 90% of their land. Today, tending a scant 4.7 million acres, which is nearly 90% land loss. And this is documented in many places, I just shout out one article here called The Great Land Robbery by Van Newkirk. This appeared in the Atlantic, but there is a lot of scholarship on this phenomenon. However, in recent years, Black agrarianism has started to make a massive comeback in communities, both urban and rural, and new attention has turned to reparations and to centering agroecology and food sovereignty in the US on Black and Indigenous land-based knowledge traditions. I just want to shout out here folks you see in the image, which include Dr. Jennifer Taylor in Florida, to Ms. Ira Wallace, Seed Keeper on the right-hand side, to the Black Dirt Farm Collective, which has recently been awarded the Food Sovereignty Prize, to the Detroit Black Food Security Network, and many more who are really at the vanguard of this revival of Black and Indigenous land care and agroecology in its particular formation in the US. In closing, if it wasn't already apparent, abolitionist agroecology requires many things, including ongoing political education. It is a touchstone for connecting past to present in order to create emancipatory futures. To borrow from abolitionist scholar at UC Riverside, Dylan Rodriguez, it's not even only about creating life-affirming institutions, be they alternatives to prisons or alternatives to factory farms. It is very much about resisting and countering the logic of power that generates those reservations, those plantations, those segregated cities, those towns. So at the center then is really a question of power. An abolitionist agroecology must therefore be generative, imaginative, productive, precisely because it entails reconfiguration of relations of power, of community, collective identity, and sociality. And I add to Dylan's word, the broader ecological world of which we are all a part. Thank you. That concludes my comments, and I'm really interested to hear any reflections you might have.